All right, hello everyone. So we're going to continue our discussion of organic chemistry with chapter 13, where we're going to be talking about alcohols, phenols, thiols, and ethers. These are four new functional groups that we're going to learn about, and that's going to be pretty typical for our study of organic chemistry. We're going to learn a new functional group. We're going to learn how to name that functional group, learn its physical properties, so something like boiling point, and then some reactions that correspond to that functional group. All right, so let's start with our first lecture here. First, I want to just introduce these functional groups to you. The first one is an alcohol, and then alcohols contain what's called a hydroxyl group or an OH group. So a classic example would be methanol, right? So we have an OH group that's bound to our carbon. Phenols. Phenols are kind of the most complex of the functional groups we're going to learn about here. That is when you have a hydroxyl group, but it's bound to a benzene ring. Okay, so they're kind of like alcohols, but bound to a benzene ring. We kind of put them in a different category than alcohols because they have a little bit different properties. A thiol is also like an alcohol, but instead of oxygen, it has sulfur. So there's an SH group. If you look on your periodic table, you'll notice that sulfur sits right underneath of oxygen. So they tend to have similar properties, same number of valence electrons, all that good stuff. So a thiol is a organic compound where you have an SH group bound to your carbon. And then an ether is kind of sort of like an alcohol, but instead of having an OH group, your oxygen is bound to two different carbons. So that's what this represents. So these are ethers. You have an oxygen that's bound to carbon on either side of it, right? So single bonded to two different carbons. That's what this represents as well. If you ever see this in organic chemistry, ROR, the R is supposed to represent any, a carbon chain of any size. Okay, so yeah, so let's learn a little bit about these. We're going to focus on alcohol. Well, I guess just to sort of show you a little bit more about them here. Again, alcohols have that OH group. That's what typifies an alcohol. A phenol, you have an OH group, but it's necessarily bound to a benzene ring. Thiols, you have that SH group, a sulfur hydrogen. And then ethers, you have an oxygen single bonded to two different carbons. Okay. So yeah, let's just talk a little bit more broadly about these because these compounds have a big role in both chemistry as well as medicine. Methanol is the simplest possible alcohol where you just have one carbon bound to an OH group. It's found in many solvents. In fact, that's an alcohol's most popular role in a chemistry lab, is playing the role of a solvent. It turns out that methanol is quite dangerous because if you ingest it, it's oxidized to formaldehyde, which is toxic and can lead to blindness. We'll talk a little bit more about what it means to be oxidized here when we get to reactions. Ethanol is what we mean by when we say the alcohol that you drink in, say, beer. Ethanol being just now a simple two-carbon alcohol, so CCOH, draw in my hydrogens. This would be ethanol. It's been around ethanol's been known for forever. You know, it's actually kind of funny, the story of why alcoholic beverages became so popular is because back in the day, clean water was incredibly hard to come by. And so what they would do is they would ferment it a little bit and produce ethanol. The alcohol would help fight the bacteria content, and thus you would drink what is, by today's standards, really dilute beer. And that was almost the cleanest source of water that existed in some parts of the world, where that water was rare. It's produced by the fermentation of sugars. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to biochemistry, but basically Bacteria, and yeast in particular is what we use when we ferment beer, has the ability to convert sugar. They basically eat sugar and poop out ethanol as well as CO2. And so that what leads to a carbonated alcoholic beverage. There's some also very closely related alcohols that are quite toxic. So like we said, methanol, which is just one carbon different from ethanol, is quite toxic, as well as 1,2-ethane diol, which is a compound that's used in antifreezes, used to synthesize synthetic fibers, as well as plastics, inks, etc. It's kind of everywhere, but if ingested, it can be quite toxic. We'll see that all of these toxicities of alcohols correspond to the fact that your body gets rid of them by oxidizing them, and that can produce some pretty nasty things. Again, we'll talk about what oxidation here is when we get to reactions. Okay, phenols. Phenols are also sort of kind of everywhere in this world with varying health consequences. Bisphenol A, which you can see below, is a really popular phenol used to make plastics. The problem is, I don't know if you've ever heard of like a BPA-free water bottle or something like that. It actually kind of has a mimicking characteristic of, not testosterone, what's the female one? Estrogen. And so it can sort of trick the body in a few ways. The problem is that they found that plastic bottles, for example, made with BPA, when you wash them under too hot of water and with certain soaps, a little bit of that BPA will actually leach out and can get into your body, and it's not terribly great for you. They also play very harmless roles, right? So this shows you just how the difference a little, one functional group can make. The main ingredient in vanilla that gives it that amazing aroma is a phenol, vanillin. Cloves, as well as thyme and nutmeg, those kind of sort of like more nuttier, spicier spices that we use, have phenols that play a predominant role in their flavoring ingredients. Okay, so some of them are completely harmless, especially in the smaller quantities, and they can be quite fragrant as well. Anesthesia, well, actually, this is anesthesias we'll get to in a second. That's actually a big role of ethers. I've saved that for another lecture. Yeah, okay, so now let's get into, so that's just a little bit of background of alcohols and phenols. Let's get into the actual sort of nitty-gritty about naming these things. First of all, let's take these two simple examples here. Methane is something that we learned to name last class when we talked about hydrocarbons. If we have a single carbon, right, and so the meth corresponded to the fact that there was one carbon, and then the ane is how you knew it was an alkane, just a simple hydrocarbon. If we have a one carbon alcohol, right, so one carbon, notice that we're going to keep that prefix meth, but now we're going to add a new ending onto it all. So the OL ending corresponds to an alcohol. Notice that the E gets dropped as well from methane. So it's not methanol, it's methanol. Typically, if your suffix that you're adding starts with a vowel, then you'll drop the E from the end of the name. If it starts with a consonant, you'll keep the E. So we'll see both the two examples of that, or both examples. When we talk about thiols, they keep the E. But for now, just note that methanol, you replace the E on the end with OL. Okay, so when we get down to our next more complicated ethane, that F referred to two carbons. When we have a two carbon alcohol, we again keep that F, but now we have the all ending, again, the OL for that alcohol. Okay, so placing the E on the end of our alkane with OL. That's how we get our alcohol name, the IUPAC name. These simpler alcohols also have common names. So for example, methanol methyl alcohol, ethanol, ethyl alcohol. I'm going to focus much more on the IUPAC name, but it is a good idea to note that, you know, common sense, you could, or rather you can use common sense to figure out what exactly the alcohol corresponding to a common name is. Okay, so let's do a few of these here. So now that we get a little bit bigger, we're going to have to introduce that numbering system as well. And just like with what we learned previously, we want to make sure to number our compounds in such a way, so let's focus on this guy here, in such a way that the functional group gets the lowest possible number. So this would be a 3-carbon compound, so we know it's going to be prop. And we're going to start numbering such that that alcohol group gets the lowest possible number. So this would be 1-propanol. Okay, you could also sort of have the nickname propyl alcohol, or the common name rather. This one here, again, it's prop, but our 3 carbons, but now our hydroxyl group is on the middle carbon. So when we go through a number, this would be 2-propanol. Common name for this would be isopropyl alcohol. Remember, isopropyl because it has 3 carbons, prop. Remember, the iso is when it makes that fork, right? So if I were to draw what this group would look like, sort of in this stick structure here, makes that fork, which would be the iso name. All right, and when we have 2 alcohol groups on a given compound, again, we're going to number such that we get the lowest possible numbering scheme. This would be 1, 2. We got 4 carbons, so it's bute. And notice that it's butane diol. So notice here that we've kept the E because we don't want to write bute and diol. We don't want to have 2 consonants next to each other. So that's when we keep the E. So it's not butanediol, it's butane diol. Di, because now we have 2 alcohol groups. Notice that we're also, right, so di corresponding to alcohol groups, and we've indicated the position of both of them using those numbers. Okay. We already did this one above. This is 2-propanol. What about this one? What do we think? And actually this one too. 1,2-butanediol. Again, just sort of practicing with our stick structures here, we're going to number in such a way that gives that hydroxyl group, that alcohol group, the lowest possible number. So this would be 2-butanol. Okay. What about when we have a ring? Similar to when we were talking about substituents on rings before, the ring is going to be our parent chain. So this is going to be a cyclohexane parent chain, right? Cyclohexanol, so not cyclohexane, but cyclohexanol to indicate the alcohol group. When there's only one substituent, remember we don't bother numbering it because it would just always be 1 cyclohexanol. There's no such thing as 2 cyclohexanol. But then as soon as we get more substituents on there, we do have to sort of indicate with the position with the numbers. Note that you're always going to start numbering from the OH group. So similar to an alkene where we like prioritize that over the other functional groups and gave it the lowest number. Alcohol groups are special like that too. So this would be 2-methyl cyclopentanol. It's not 2-methyl-1-cyclopentanol because again, we're just going to assume the OH group is at position 1, but we do have to indicate that where the methyl group is, because that would be different from, say, this would be 3-methyl cyclohexanol. Okay, so we got to indicate where that methyl group is relative to the hydroxyl group. All right, so now let's go naming something from scratch. Again, this is going to be a very similar concept than to what we employed before. Step one, find the parent chain, the longest set of contiguous carbons. So this right here would be my parent chain for this compound. What we said before is that once you get your parent chain, there are two ways to number it. We can go left to right, which is sort of the normal way we read. Or we could go right to left. But we're going to pick the numbering scheme that gives us the lowest possible numbers. Now, in the red scheme, I would have a 2 on the methyl group, and in the blue scheme, I would have a 2 on the hydroxyl group. You're always going to prioritize the alcohol group. So in this case, the blue numbering scheme is correct, because we're going to prioritize giving the lowest number to that alcohol. So that means that now our methyl group is sitting at carbon 5. So this would be 5-methyl, 2, and then we have 6 carbons in our parent chain, so hexanol. Okay, I just want to point out, because we did one example like this, so let's just make sure we know how to do it. What if there was a second OH group on this carbon? That would be 5-methyl 2,2-hexane diol, right, where I keep the E. So for a single alcohol group, I drop the E, replace it with OL. If there's more than one alcohol group, diols, triols, you're going to keep the E and then put in that suffix or that prefix di or tri or whatever it is.